Hello everyone. In this video we will learn what JSON is, what AJAX is, and how to use these two things together to pull new data into our web pages on the fly. Let's begin by looking at a demo of the finished product that we will be building together in this video. So on this page we have a heading and a blue button, and when I click the blue button, info for 3 animals gets loaded in. So info on Meowsy the cat, Barky the dog, and Purpaws the cat is loaded in, and if I click the blue button again, Whiskers, Woof, and Fluffy get loaded in, and if I click it one more time, the button disappears and Kitty, Pupster, and Tux appear. Now, using JavaScript to respond to click events and manipulating the page is nothing new. We've already learned how to do that in previous videos. The point of this example is that this content is being loaded on the fly. What do I mean by that? Well, if we view the source for this HTML page, so view page source, notice that we don't see any of those sentences about the animals. This is because when this page first loads, it doesn't contain any of that data. Instead, I've used JavaScript to say that when this button gets clicked, the web browser should go out onto the internet, download a tiny bit of new data from a different URL, and then again I use JavaScript to output that data into this empty div and onto the page. And all of this happens on the fly without a page refresh. This might not be the most exciting project in the world, but I promise it will teach you the basics of JSON and AJAX. Let's get started. Alright, so behind the scenes I just removed all of the JavaScript from this page. So now if I click the button, absolutely nothing happens. So now you and I can start from this same beginning and move forward together. So if I jump over to my text editor, we will review this HTML a bit later in the video, but it's not important for now. All that is important right now is that you create a new HTML file on your computer so you can follow along. And be sure to include a reference to a new JavaScript file. If you're not sure how to do that, I recommend watching my JavaScript in half an hour video. But for now, let's keep things rolling. So I'm going to jump over to my brand new, completely empty JavaScript file, and let's write some code. Now we'll need to learn how to walk before we can run. So what I mean by that is before we learn how to tell the browser to go download new data from a different URL, before we do that, let's first learn about the most common way of storing and working with data in JavaScript, which is JSON. It all boils down to 2 things: objects and arrays. Let's talk about objects first. So let's say I want to store data about a cat, and I want all of this data to live within one variable or one object. So I could create a variable and name it my cat and say that it is an object. And then I can assign it different properties and values. So I can say that the object should have a property named name, and then we assign it a value. So maybe the cat's name is Meows a lot. And this object can have a different property. So let's add a species property and give it a value of cat. And let's add one more property named fave food. And we'll give it a value of tuna. All right, so this is an object. Now, if I wanted to access the cat's name somewhere else in my code, I would just type my cat dot name. And this would return a value of Meows a lot. Or if I wanted to access the cat's favorite food, I would just say my cat dot fave food. And this would return a value of tuna. All right, so this is an example of how to access data that lives in an object. Now let's talk about arrays. Let's imagine I want to create a single variable that contains all of my favorite colors. So to do that, I would use an array. So let's delete this, and instead let's create a new variable. I will name it my fave colors. And let's tell it to be an array. So we say equal and then a pair of square brackets. And an array is just a comma separated list. So I would list my first favorite color, blue, and then a comma, and then I can include another value. So green, and then a comma, and I can include another value, purple. All right, so this is an array. And if I needed to access the second item in the array, so the value of green, if I wanted to access that somewhere else in my code, I would just type my fave colors, square brackets, and then the number 1. We would use the number 1 to access the second value because arrays are 0 based. meaning you would access the first value with a 0 here instead of a 1. You access the second value with a 1, you would access the third value with a 2, so on and so forth. All right, so this is how you access data that lives in an array. So to recap, so far we've seen an object by itself, we've seen an array by itself. Now what if we do something crazy and combine the two? So for example, what if we wanted to have a single variable that contained data for multiple pets? We can do that by creating a new variable. So let me delete this line. Let's create a new variable named the pets. Let's tell it to be an array. Only this time we don't want an array of simple text string values. This time we want an array of objects. So to define an object, you just open up a pair of curly brackets. So we could define our first animal or pet object within these brackets and then include a comma, and then another object, and then a comma, and then another object. You get the idea. But including this much data on a single line of code can begin to look messy or complicated. So instead, let's drop down to a new line in between our array square brackets. And then in between those two lines, we can create curly brackets for an object. And let's just create two. Let's say we want 2 pets or 2 animals to live within this array. All right, now let's actually define our objects. So we can just copy the code that we have up here. So I will copy these 3 lines into my clipboard. And then within our curly brackets down here, I'll just drop down to a new line and paste in. So our first pet object in this array is Meowsalot the cat. Let's paste those 3 lines into our second object, only this time we'll change the name to Barky. And we'll say that Barky is a dog, and we'll say that his favorite food is carrots. And we can delete these lines, we don't need them anymore. All right, so now we have a single variable that contains all of our data. And I have a surprise for you. You just learned JSON. So the code that I have highlighted right now is an example of JSON. Objects and arrays nested inside each other. JSON is just a popular and agreed upon format for sending, receiving, and storing data. The JSON acronym stands for JavaScript Object Notation. All right, and as an example, if we wanted to access Barky's favorite food somewhere else in our code, we would just type out the name of our variable, so the pets. It's an array, and we want to access data that lives in the second item of the array. Arrays are 0-based, so to access the second item, we would say 1. And then it's an object, so to access one of its properties, we just include a period, and then the name of the property we want, and that's it. So this would return a value of carrots. As another example, if we wanted to create HTML paragraph elements with sentences for each object that read Meowsalot is a cat that loves tuna and Barky is a dog that loves carrots. If we wanted to do that, we would just loop through this array and create an HTML text string and then add it to the DOM. Now we will learn how to do exactly that step by step in detail a bit later on in the video, but for now let's keep things rolling. So we've learned about JSON, now let's learn about AJAX. Alright, so we have a bit of JSON data here, but in the real world you typically won't have JSON data just conveniently sitting in your JavaScript file like this. In the real world, you'd probably need to load JSON from a dynamic source like another URL that is powered by a database. So let's make it our goal for the remainder of this video to load the JSON data from this URL. I encourage you to follow along on your computer, so you can either pause the video right now and type out this URL, or the easier option is to just copy and paste this URL by finding it in the description for this video. Either way, our goal for the remainder of this video is to use JavaScript and AJAX to visit this URL and download this JSON data on the fly so that we can use it on our web page. Okay, so to get started, let's jump back to our JavaScript file and let's delete everything we have and start fresh. All right, now the process of sending or receiving data on the fly without a page reload is known as AJAX. And we'll learn what that acronym stands for in just a moment. Now, web browsers have a built-in tool named XML HTTP request. And this tool will do the heavy lifting for us. This tool will establish a connection with a URL that we specify, and then it lets us send or receive data. So let's create a new instance of this tool. To begin, we will create a new variable, We could name the variable anything we'd like, but I'm going to name it our request. And then we just set that variable to equal a new instance of the XML HTTP request tool. All right, now we just need to tell our variable to actually do something. Now the web browser will expect our variable to use a method named open. So to specify that, we just say our request.open, and this is our chance to say what we want to do. So we will want to pass this open method two arguments. The first argument is whether we want to send data or receive data. In our case, we want to receive data. We want to download data. So we say get. We want to go get data. If instead we wanted to send data to a server, we would say post. But we want to download or get data, so we say get. And the second argument that we will want to give this method is simply the URL that we want to talk to. So in this case, that's the URL that I showed a moment ago. So again, you can pause the video and type out this URL, or you can find this URL in the description for this video and just copy and paste it. But either way, we want this URL. This is where the JSON lives. So I copied that URL into my clipboard, and then back in my text editor, I'm just going to paste it in as the second argument. So this line of code will tell the browser to go to this URL and get the JSON data. Now next, we need to actually do something with that data. So let's drop down to a new line. We'll start with our variable, so our request, and we want to use a method named onLoad. So this is where we say what should happen once the data is loaded. So we're just going to set this to equal an anonymous function. All right, and within the body of this function, we can do anything we'd like. Just as a quick example or a quick test, let's log out the JSON data that we download out to the console. So console.log, and we can access the data that we just downloaded by saying our request.response text. All right, so at this point, we've defined our request. The final step is to actually send the request. So we just say our request.send. All right, so if I save this and visit my HTML page in the browser and refresh, and if I view my developer tools console, perfect. So here we see the content from the URL that we specified. Okay, so we logged that out to the console as a proof of concept. Now let's try to do something more useful with the data. Let's try saving it to a variable. So back in our text editor, within the onLoad function, let's delete this line where we log it out to the console. And instead, let's create a variable. We could name it anything we'd like. I will name it our data, and then just set it to equal the contents from the URL that we specified. So to access that content, it's our request.response text. All right, so now we have all of the data within our convenient new variable name. Now let's give ourselves a new example task. Let's imagine we only want to log out to the console the first pet object within this array of data. So for example, if I go back to that URL, currently the our data variable contains all of this content. And just as an exercise, let's try to log out only this first object out to the console. So only the info about Meowsy the cat. So back in our text editor, to do that, we could drop down to a new line and say console.log. We know that that data lives in our data variable, and we know that that is an array of objects. So if we only want the first item in the array, 0. All right, now if I save this and refresh, we see that the only thing that got logged out to the console is an opening square bracket. Now this is not what we were hoping to see, but let me explain why this happened. By default, when our browser goes out to this URL and downloads this data, it doesn't know to interpret this as JSON data, right? So by default, the web browser doesn't know that this is an object or that the entire thing is an array of objects. By default, the browser is just interpreting this as plain text, as a giant text string. So back in our text editor, when we said go into the our data variable and return the first item in the array, our browser says, okay, this data is just a simple text string, not a traditional array. And the first item in the text string, if you treat a text string like an array, is just this opening square bracket. So that's why that's all we received when we tried to log it out to the console. So obviously the solution here is to tell our browser to not view this as a giant text string, but instead to interpret it as real JSON data, as objects and arrays. So back in our code, when we are taking the response text or the content that lives at the URL and saving it into our variable, we want to first tell the browser to interpret this as JSON data. So let's delete this. And instead we can use a tool that our browser has built into it. So JSON.parse. And then within these parentheses, we can include the content that gets pulled in from the URL. So now we can say our request.response text. So now the content that lives at that URL will be passed through our browser's JSON filter. So if we save this and refresh our web page and check out the console, perfect. We see only the first object on Meowsy the cat. And congratulations, you just performed your first bit of AJAX. Let's take a minute to talk about the AJAX name. So the AJAX acronym stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. The word asynchronous in this context just means in the background or not requiring a page refresh. And if you're wondering what XML is a data format that's very similar to JSON. Now we are not going to actually use XML, we are using JSON instead. So I guess you could call what we're doing AJAX instead of AJAX, right? So it's asynchronous JavaScript and JSON. Because in recent years, JSON has replaced XML as the more popular data format. So JSON has become the industry standard data format. But XML was very important for a very long time. And overall, XML was very important to the history of modern web development. So that's why the AJAX name sticks, even though most of us are using JSON instead of XML. And just in case you were curious, this also explains why the browser's built-in tool is named XML HTTP request. We are technically using this tool to go out and download JSON, not XML data. But again, XML was so integral to the history of web development that the name just kind of stays around, even if that's not exactly what you're doing. All right, let's move on. Now at this point in the lesson, we've learned what JSON is, we've learned what AJAX is, and we've successfully pulled in data on the fly and saved it to a variable. So now, for the remainder of this video, it's really just a matter of completing generic JavaScript tasks, right? So number one, we need to respond to the blue button click events. And number two, we need to add new HTML to the page based on the contents of the our data variable. All right, so let's get to work. Currently, our code is set up so that our AJAX call to download new data runs as soon as the page loads. And we don't want that. We only want to go and download the new data if and when someone clicks the blue button. So let's begin by adding an event listener for this blue button, and then we will only run our AJAX call when that event is triggered. So to begin, let's create a JavaScript variable that points towards the blue button HTML element. So in my HTML file, here is the blue button element, and you can see that I've given it an ID of button or BTN. So make sure that your HTML looks similar to this, and then back in our JavaScript, up at the very top, let's create a variable. We can name it anything we'd like. I'm just going to name it button or BTN. And then I'm just going to select that HTML button element. So document, get element by ID, button. All right, so now we have this convenient variable that points towards that element. Now let's set up an event listener for when the button gets clicked. So we just say button, add event listener. The event that we are listening for is the click event. And then what do we want to actually happen when it gets clicked? Well, instead of calling a specific function, let's just open an anonymous function here. All right, and now within the body of this anonymous function, we can just cut and paste our AJAX call. So all of these lines that we wrote earlier, I'm going to cut them into my clipboard. And then within this anonymous function, I'm just going to paste in my clipboard. All right, so if I save this and refresh in the browser, notice that my console is empty, but as soon as I click the blue button, now if I check my console, we see that our AJAX request ran successfully. All right, next, we don't actually want to log anything to the console, That was just for testing purposes. What we actually want to do is add HTML paragraph elements for each animal that says their name, their species, so on and so forth. So back in the text editor, within our onLoad function, let's remove this line where we are logging data out to the console. And we could technically write code here that adds HTML to the page. But in order to stay organized, why don't we create a new function down at the very bottom of our file whose sole job is to create and add HTML to the page. So this way our code stays organized. So let's create a new function. We can name it anything we'd like. I'm going to name it render HTML. All right, we will build out what this function actually does in just a moment. But first, within our AJAX call, now we will simply call the render HTML function. So render HTML, and we want to be sure to pass this function the OurData variable so that it can work with the data. So within the parentheses, when we are calling the function, we can just pass in OurData. All right, now within the signature for our new custom function, within these parentheses, we just need to include one parameter name. We can name it anything we'd like. Let's just call it data for short. All right, and now within this function, we can access the JSON data that got pulled in with AJAX by simply saying data, okay? But let's start simple. So remember, this function's job is to add HTML to the page. More specifically, it's going to add HTML to this empty div element. Notice that I've given the empty div element an ID of animal info. So make sure that your HTML looks similar to this. And then within our JavaScript, up at the very top, let's create a variable that points towards the empty div. So variable, we can name it anything we'd like. I will call it animal container. And then we just select the empty div. So document get element by ID. And it had an ID of animal info. All right, so now within our render HTML function, we can target that empty div by using its variable. So animal container. And then we can use a method that is available to all DOM elements named insert adjacent HTML. Let's say that we want to add HTML right before the end of this element. So we say before end, comma, and then the second argument is simply the content or HTML that we want to add. So if we said testing 1, 2, 3, save this and refresh the page and click the blue button, we see testing 1, 2, 3. All right, only instead of spelling out the text we want within this function call, instead, why don't we create a variable? We can name it anything we'd like. I will name it HTML string, and let's set it to equal this is a test. And then down on this line, instead of spelling out the content we want, let's just point towards this variable name. So HTML string. So if we save this and test it out, click the blue button. Now the reason this is nice is now we are free to loop through the JSON data that we received via AJAX. We can loop through that data and just continually add on or concatenate to this variable. It's hard to explain with words, so let me just show you what I'm talking about. So when we first define this variable, let's actually tell it to just be an empty string. All right, and then on a new line, what we are going to do is loop through our array of pet objects and do something once for each object in the array. Now, if you've never used a for loop before, I recommend watching my JavaScript in half an hour video. It explains how for loops work in detail. Because in order to keep this video rolling along at a nice pace, I'm just going to have to assume that you understand for loops. All right, so let's begin a for loop. So I will begin as 0, and we want the for loop to run as long as I is less than the length of our array. So remember, our array of objects, we can access it with data. So I'll just say as long as I is less than data.length. Then we want to increment I each time the loop runs. All right, and then within these curly brackets, we get to say what should happen for each item in the array. So what we want to do is just add on or concatenate on to our HTML string variable. So let's say HTML string, we want to add on to it, so +, equal sign. And remember, we want to create a paragraph element for each object in the array. So we'll open up a p tag, and then let's output the name of each animal or each pet. Remember, we can access the JSON data with the word data. So we'll say data, which gives us the array of objects. Look inside that array for the first item. So because I equals 0 to begin with, this will select the first object in the array, which is Meowsy the cat. And then once the loop runs again, I will get incremented, so I will equal 1. And then when this code runs again, this would obviously select the second object in the array, so on and so forth. Okay, but remember here, we're trying to output the name of the object. So just to put this into context, if we look at the URL of where we're grabbing the JSON from, each object in the array has a name property. So back in our code, we can access that property by saying .name. And then let's say that that animal is A. And then let's output their species property. So data, select whichever item in the array we've looped through. And then we want the species property. All right, and then let's just add a period at the end of our sentence and close out the paragraph element. So we'll add a period and we'll close out the paragraph element. All right, let's save this and refresh our page and hit the blue button. Perfect. We see Meowsy the cat, Barky the dog, and Purpaws the cat. But what if we click the blue button a second time? Well, currently that will load the same 3 animals again, which is not what we want. We want to load new data for 3 different animals. So check this out. If I go back to that URL that we are loading with AJAX, notice that the URL ends in -1.json. And if I visit a slightly different URL of -2 instead of -1, notice that this URL has information for 3 different animals. So Whiskers the cat, Woof the dog, and Fluffy the cat. So a big part of AJAX is requesting data from the right URL at the right moment. So let's adjust our code so that the first time someone clicks on the blue button, we load the -1 URL. The second time the button gets clicked, we load data from -2. And the third time the button gets clicked, we will load -3.json, and we will hide the blue button so that it cannot be clicked a 4th time. Okay, so to do that, let's begin by jumping over to our JavaScript. And up on the very first line, let's create a new variable that equals 1. And then we can increment or increase that variable by 1 each time the button gets clicked. So let's create a variable. We could name it anything, but I will name it page counter. And we want it to begin with a value of 1. All right, next, on the line where we specify which URL we want to download data from, we want to make this URL dynamic with the help of our page counter variable. So here's the URL that we are currently downloading data from. And if I scroll to the right a bit, here we see the -1 part of the URL. Let's replace the hard-coded value of 1 with our page counter variable. So we'll close out that first quote, and then we'll add in our variable. So page counter, and then we will just add in this closing string. All right, and then if I scroll back to the left, after this line of code where we send our AJAX request, we just want to increment our page counter value by 1. So we can just say page counter ++. Okay, so now when someone clicks the blue button for the first time, page counter will have a value of 1, so it will load the -1 JSON file. Right after that happens, the variable will be incremented, so then it's 2. So then obviously the next time we click the button, it will load the -2 JSON file. All right, so let's save this and take it for a spin. First click, we see Meowsy, Barky, and Purpaws. Second click, Whiskers, Woof, and Fluffy. And third click, Kitty, Pupster, and Tux. And if I click the button a 4th time, nothing happens. And if I check the console, we actually see an error message. So you can see that it's trying to find the URL that lives at animals-4.json. And that file doesn't exist. Okay, so if we know that the server only has animals-1 through 3, after the 3rd click, we should have this blue button disappear so that it can't be clicked any longer. So to make that happen, back in our text editor, after the line where we increment our page counter variable, let's just add an if statement. And we'll say if the page counter variable is larger than 3, if that's the case, if that's true, then let's add a CSS class to the button element that hides it. So we have our button variable that targets that element. We will adjust its class list. We will add a CSS class named hide me. So you will want to add a bit of CSS to your page. You'll want to add a class named HideMe and set its display value to none, or set its visibility to hidden. You get the idea. So if I save that and refresh the page, 1 click, 2 click, 3rd click, the button disappears. Perfect. Okay, now all that's left is to also output each animal's favorite and least favorite foods. So for example, if we look at the raw JSON data that we are working with, we know that we have the name property and the species property. We also have a foods property, which in and of itself is an object that contains other children properties. So the foods object contains a likes property and a dislikes property. And notice that the values for the likes and dislikes properties are actually arrays. So Whiskers the cat likes multiple foods. He likes celery and strawberries. This is the neat thing about JSON. It lets us nest objects inside of objects. And it lets us nest arrays inside of arrays. All right, so for this last part of the video, let's work on outputting the favorite and least favorite foods onto the page. So back in our text editor, let's scroll down to our render HTML function. And on this line, we no longer want to end the sentence and end the paragraph element. So instead, let's change this to read, blank name is a blank species that likes to eat. All right, and then on the next line, we will list and loop through their favorite foods. So let's drop down to a new line. And remember that currently we are in a for loop. So the code we write here will run once for each object in the array. So we just want to look for the current object's foods property. And we want to look inside it for the likes property, which is an array. And then we just want to loop through that to list out all of their favorite foods. All right, so back in our code, to loop through that array of favorite foods, we will want to use a for loop nested within our current for loop. So we'll say for. Let's use double I for our counter to loop through this nested favorite foods array. So we'll say that as long as double I is less than the length of the favorite foods array, so we'll say data, the current object in the array that we have looped to, and then we want to look inside it for the foods property. And then inside that, we want to look for the likes property, and we want to find out how many items there are in it, so dot length. All right, and then the final part of our for loop, we want to increment II by 1. All right, and then let's open up a pair of curly brackets. So now anything we write will run once for each of the favorite food items. So we just want to concatenate them to the HTML string. So we'll say HTML string, add on to it, plus equals, and then we just want to add on the current favorite food. So data, the current item we've looped through, foods, likes, and likes is an array itself, so then we want the current item, which is our counter, II. All right, and then after this nested for loop, but still within our overall for loop, let's be sure to add in the closing period and the closing paragraph tag. So on this line, we can just say HTML string and add on a period and a closing p tag. Let's save this and refresh. So it looks like we need to add a space in between each individual food, right? So there should be a space between tuna and catnip, and there should be a space between bones and carrots. So to do that, back in our code, within our nested for loop, let's use an if statement. So to begin, let's cut this line of code into our clipboard, this line of code where we are outputting each favorite food. So I'll cut that. All right, and now let's use an if statement. So we'll say, if the current favorite food that we are outputting is the first item in the array, we'll do one thing, but otherwise else, if it's the second or third favorite food, we'll do something else. All right, so within this first condition of the if statement, we can paste our clipboard back in. So if it's the first favorite food in the array, this works fine, but otherwise, if it's the second or third favorite food item, let's be sure to add in a space, the word and then another space, and then output the favorite food. All right, so let's save this and refresh. Perfect. Likes to eat tuna and catnip, bones and carrots. All right, and now we just need to do the same thing for each animal's least favorite foods. So back in our JavaScript, after this nested for loop, let's add a bit of text to our string. So HTML string, and we'll add a space and say, and dislikes. All right, and then we can really just copy and paste this nested for loop and tell it to work with the dislikes array instead of the likes array. So let's just copy this to our clipboard. And then after this line, let's paste in our clipboard. Let's change this from likes to dislikes. Change this to dislikes and this to dislikes. All right, let's save this and refresh. Meowsy is a cat that likes to eat tuna and catnip and dislikes ham and zucchini. Beautiful. And if we click the button a few more times, it's working just like we had hoped. Now before we bring this video to a close, I want to try and answer a few of the most common questions you might have right now. So question number 1 is, where will I know to look for JSON URLs in the real world? Right? Because in the real world, there won't be some guy on YouTube telling you the exact URLs to look for. The answer is that every system is different. It just depends on the source of your data. Are you trying to pull data from WordPress? Are you trying to pull data from a weather forecast service? Or from a custom PHP or Node API that you built that pulls data from a database? You get the idea. So there are a million possibilities, and each system will generate slightly different URLs that you can tweak to return different JSON. So remember in our example how we could tweak this number to be either 1, 2, or 3 to pull in different data? Well, in the real world, many of the JSON URLs that you visit will have parameters that you can include in the URL to control how many items are returned, which items are returned, and the order that they are returned in, so on and so forth. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can look up REST APIs. All right, now as of the recording of this video, there was a neat website named Philtext. This website has a bunch of example JSON endpoint URLs that you can experiment with if you feel like practicing AJAX. Okay, question number 2. Creating an HTML string that used our JSON data was not very enjoyable. Is there a better way of doing that? The answer is absolutely yes, there is a better way. I only used concatenation and for loops like that in this video because I didn't want to introduce yet another different technology. But in the real world, I'd recommend a JavaScript templating solution named Handlebars. Handlebars has been around for a long time, it's super popular, super useful, and it makes creating HTML out of JSON data much, much simpler. I'll try to cover Handlebars in a future video. All right, and the final question, question number 3, what about error handling for our AJAX requests, right? Because we don't live in a perfect world, and sometimes the browser connection to go out and send or receive data will fail. Well, the good news is that it's very simple to set up error handling. So let me jump into the JavaScript file and we can set up error handling right now. So if I scroll up a bit, right before this line of code where we send our AJAX request, let's add a new line. And let's say our request dot on error. And let's tell it to equal an anonymous function. And now this is your chance to say what should happen if the connection just fails outright. So maybe the user's internet connection is temporarily down or something like that. So you could just log out to the console. Just as an example, you could say connection error. Obviously in the real world, you'd want to do something more useful than just logging out to the console. But the general idea is that this is how you handle outright connection failures. And then there will be other times where your internet connection is working just fine and you're able to connect to the URL or server that you're trying to connect to. But for whatever reason, the server itself returns an error or the data just doesn't come through correctly. And to cover that case, we can just add another layer of error handling. So within our onLoad function, let's add a new line and let's add an if statement to look for potential errors. So we'll say if our request dot status, if it is equal to or greater than 200 and that same value, our request.status, is also less than 400. This means that we were able to successfully receive the data. So if things are successful, we just want to run the code that we already had. So I'm just going to cut these two lines into these curly brackets. But if this isn't the case, that means we ran into an error after we connected to this URL. So then we can just say else and then you would handle the error here. So you would do something more useful than this, but I'm just going to log out to the console and say we connected to the server, but it returned an error. All right, and that's how you implement basic error handling for your AJAX requests. That's going to bring this video to a close. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you feel like you learned something, and stay tuned for a new video next Tuesday. Thanks, bye. If you haven't already, be sure to check out my brand new Get a Web Developer Job, Mastering the Modern Workflow course. As always, there's a link to it in the description.